So, Dr. Chet, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Good, sir. So, with your permission, then we can begin today's program.
Yeah, please.
All right. So, very good afternoon to all of you, and welcome. My greetings on the World Environment Day. I think it's a day when we not only rededicate ourselves to the environment, but we also get a sense of where the environment is going and how we nurture the nature that is around us. And we should also realize that we are only a minuscule part of the nature that we live in, and we need to be sort of cognizant of the fact. And we are very privileged, sir, that we have with us today a very, very distinguished scientist and able administrator, but above all, a very, I would say, gentle human being who not only believes that nature should be preserved at all costs, but also does a lot in that direction. So I'd like to welcome a very respected Professor P. Balram, who has been a former director of the Indian Institute of Science. But as I mentioned, he has also been an avid author. He used to write for Current Science very prolifically. So I think we are very blessed that we have you with us, sir. Thank you very much for accepting our request. And I must mention that the Center for Biomedical Research in Lucknow is an autonomous body of the government of Uttar Pradesh, and we are working towards patient care primarily and trying to develop not only test methods, but also trying to develop biomarkers that can help in diagnosis of patients at an early stage or differentiate between two diseases at an early stage. So I think it's a very proud moment for CBMR. And this program has been jointly organized with the UP Academy of Sciences, which again feels very privileged to be associated with you, sir, that you have accepted our invitation. And with this short introduction and not taking much time, I will request my co-host, Dr. C.M. Nautiyal, who is again who superannuated as scientist in charge of the radiocarbon lab of Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleobotany as scientist F. But also he is a person who has taken up the mantle of popularizing science, and he is a great communicator and has, to his credit, more than 850 popular lectures. Apart from that, he's written over 100 popular articles on science and has been part of the organizing programs of late Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, Professor Yashpal, Professor CNR Rao, Professor Narlikar, Professor Mashelkar, and so forth. And I think it is, and he's also the secretary of the UP Academy of Sciences. I also welcome Professor P.K. Seth, who is not only the founder of the first biotech park in Lucknow as a CEO, but also was the former director of CSIR, Indian Institute of Toxicology Research. So, and we were very fortunate to have his lecture on the INSA platform this morning. So welcome you, sir. I also welcome my colleague, Dr. Neeraj Sinha, who is a professor at CBMR and also the dean. So with this, I hand over to you, Dr. Nautiyal, to take the proceedings forward, please.
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. The chair, Professor Seth, Professor P. Balram, Dr. Dhawan, and the distinguished audience. It's a matter of great pleasure for us to have Professor P. Balram with us, whom most of us have known as a scientist of great excellence, a former director of Indian Institute of Science, and also as a legendary editor of Current Science. Professor P. Balram Padma Bhushan is a chair professor now with the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. He completed first graduation from Ferguson College, University of Pune, master's from the IIT Kanpur, the great place, and PhD in 1972 in chemistry from the Carnegie Mellon University, USA. It was followed by a PDF stint at Harvard University during 1972-1973, the Nobel laureate Robert Burns Woodward, and then he returned as lecturer to the Indian Institute of Science. In the year 1973, where he rose to become a professor and later director of the Indian Institute of Science in the year 2005, there for almost a decade as director. In a rare combination, Professor Balram not only made outstanding contributions to research, but is also regarded as an exceptional teacher, outstanding science communicator, and a legendary editor, as I said just now. His work with colleagues improved understanding of the structure and function of voltage-gated transmembrane peptide channels and provided the basis for formulating the helix dipole model for these channels. His contributions in the general area of design and synthesis of model peptides are also highly valued. How many 100 papers he published in peer-reviewed journals and all those details I'm not mentioning, but he is one of the epitomes of scientific excellence in the country. He was associate editor of the Indian Journal of Chemical Education and the editor of Current Science. He was on the editorial board of several national and international journals, such as International Journal of Peptide and Protein Research, Indian Journal of Chemistry, Section B, Indian Journal of Biochemistry and Biophysics, and also the Proceedings of the Indian National Science Academy, Section B. Incidentally, INSA happens to be the organization with which I am associated now as a consultant for science communication. Professor Balram received the INSA Medal for Young Scientists in the year 1977, UGC Career Award in 1979, UGC National Lecture in 1986-87, SS Bhatnagar Award in 1986, and the list doesn't end here. He also received the Alumni Award for Excellence in Research by the ISC in the year 1991, Department of Atomic Energy C.V. Raman Lecture in 1991, D.D. Birla Award in 1994, the TWAS Award in 1994, Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Lecture in 1995, and Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Visiting Fellowship in 1996, USA. Most of the people who are career scientists here know perhaps about all these things, but know about these things, but this is mostly for the benefits of the younger group. In recognition of his contribution, he was conferred with Padma Bhushan in the year 2014, and the latest feather is in 2021, R. Bruce Merrifield Award by the American Peptide Society. He's a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy in New Delhi, Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore, and also the Academy of Sciences for the Developing World. Professor Balram is a very, very popular speaker and has made significant contribution in the area of popularization of science as well as science policy. He edited Current Science with panache till 2013 and broke many hearts when he decided to quit and let someone else take over. Just to quote a few, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan said, he found the editorials of Current Science inseparable from the journal. Professor V. Venkateswara Sarma of University of Pondicherry remarked that people like Professor Balram are very rare and precious species. He, however, rued that unfortunately neither India nor any other country has any rewards for editor's job of scientific journal. Dr. A.K. Bachawat appreciated his talent and was all praised for his thought-provoking style, his incisive perspective, the wonderful balance, the scholarship, the high literary value, and the tongue-in-cheek, all combined to make it a treat to read. But Dr. Swaminathan perhaps summed it up best. And he said that Professor Balram is a role model for all scientists. So we are very happy to have you, Professor Balram sir, here amongst us, and we are keen to listen to you.
Professor Balram, please.
Thank you, Professor Nautiyal, for that very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank Dr. Dhawan for inviting me. And it's a very great pleasure to see Dr. Seth after a very long time, although virtually. And I have been at the CBMR at Lucknow many years ago when Professor Khetrapal was the director. So I have visited the institution. Today, on the occasion of World Environment Day, when Dr. Dhawan asked me to talk, I realized that I'm not really an environmentalist. I'm not a person who really has contributed anything towards protecting our environment. But I asked myself the question, what is our environment? Our environment is nature. We are all part of it. We're all part of our own environments also. So I thought I would talk generally to you about nature and as it is viewed through the lens of the two subjects that I'm familiar with, chemistry on the one hand and biology on the other. My introductory slide merely shows you two of the pillars on which the modern disciplines of chemistry and biology rest. Mendeleev's periodic table on the left and Darwin's origin of species and natural selection on the right. In the middle of the slide, you have the various images of the coronavirus. Now, of course, you can ask the question, does the coronavirus is a part of nature? Does it belong to chemistry or does it belong to biology? Let me move. I have a problem now with slide. I'll go back and start sharing again. I'll stop share and share once more. This is one of the problems in my slides come back.
Yeah, sir, they're coming up, sir. Yeah, it's come back.
Okay, come back.
Sure, sir.
Let me just shift.
So you'll have to go full screen and then change.
Right.
Yeah, that's fine, sir. Thank you.
Now, of course, I wondered about World Environment Day. And of course, you have the slogan which the United Nations puts out, which says reimagine, recreate, and restore. It sounds very good, but it's difficult to imagine what we are going to reimagine, what we are going to recreate, and what we are going to restore. Now, there are many images that are there on the internet. I looked at them. All of them were green, and all of them had plants. And it almost appeared that the only way that you would protect your environment was to plant more and to plant more trees. One has to ask the question at this point, what do we mean by the environment and what do we mean by nature? And that is really the subject of my presentation based upon the chemistry and physics that biology that I'm familiar with. Down below, there are two images which I have picked off the internet. The first of these is a demonstration in New York, which happened on the 22nd of April, 1970. This is when the first Earth Day was celebrated. That's over 50 years ago. Now, of course, 50 years later, this is what the same place looked like. Everybody masked, flowers in their hand. But these are now symbolic expressions of protecting the environment. One can ask the question, what happened in the intervening 50 years? You can see that more and more challenges to the environment were posed in the intervening 50 years. So the environment and its protection is an extraordinarily political subject because protecting the environment clashes with the imperatives of human development. Therefore, there is always this conflict between development and the environment. I will stick to the safer subject of nature. What is nature? How do we define nature? You can't do better than read the editorial in the first issue of the Journal of Nature. In the Journal of Nature, that was on November 4th, 1869. The editorial was written by Thomas Huxley, the famous biologist. But Huxley didn't write the editorial. What he did was he translated an essay written by the German von Goethe. He translated the essay on nature into English. And you can see what Goethe says. He says, nature, we are surrounded and embraced by her, powerless to separate ourselves from her and powerless to penetrate beyond her. You can't get a better definition of nature than this. Nature has always fascinated poets, for instance. The Renaissance poets in English often used nature. Wordsworth, for example, said, to the solid ground of nature, trust the mind which builds for us. So connections between the mind, nature, what we perceive as the environment is very, very important. But biology as we know it today rests on the work of Darwin. It is the work of Darwin that needs to be understood by anybody wanting to understand modern biology. But in his Origin of Species, Darwin summarized his view of natural selection like this. He said there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally bred by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about evolution. I'm going to eventually come to ask, how did life evolve on Earth? Because we are today thinking of protecting our environment, but we need to understand how our environment actually came into being. Darwin himself did not write much about the origin of life except in letters. In 1863, he wrote that it is mere rubbish thinking at present of origin of life. One might as well think of the origin of matter. This is where chemistry comes in, because the matter is all chemistry. 8 years later, he wrote again to his friend. And in this he said, but if, and oh, what a big if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo more complex changes. It was the first time in the literature, 1871, that you would have heard of the term protein coming into biology, and Darwin was already imagining where could all these things have come about. Biochemistry as we know it, which really relates chemistry to biology, has its origins in this paper of Buchner in 1896, where he demonstrated cell-free fermentation by yeast. He showed that if you took sugar, a yeast extract could convert it now into ethanol. This is the starting point of biochemistry. But we might ask the question, in order to start biochemistry, we must have chemistry, which means we must have Mendeleev's periodic table. Mendeleev's periodic table, which summarizes all the elements which are there, the Earth received these elements. The Earth received these elements when the Earth was formed. And where did these elements come from? That's the next question that one must ask. But here on this table, all that I've done is I've colored the elements. The light green are the elements of organic chemistry, are the elements of biochemistry. The light pink are all the other elements which are important in biochemistry. Nature uses all of them. Nature uses even more elements than are here. Vanadium is also used by nature. So there are many other elements. Let's ask ourselves a simple question. If you want to have life on Earth, we must have elements we must have chemicals, we must have cells. Where did the elements come from? I draw your attention here to a book which is a favorite book of mine, Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. This is based on a set of lectures given in the early 1970s on the BBC. It's a wonderful series, and you can see some of it on YouTube even today. And what Bronowski says that in all the stars there are going on processes which build up the atoms one by one into more complex structures. And then he says beautifully that matter itself evolves. The word comes from Darwin and biology, but it is the word that changed physics in my lifetime. One of the things, if there are students listening, is that every discipline of science is interrelated, is needed if one is going to understand nature. He has a very poetic description of the formation of carbon. He says carbon, for instance, is formed in a star when 3 helium nuclei collide at one spot within less than 1/1,000,000 of a millionth of a second. That is 10 to the minus 12 of a second. It's a collision of two carbons, for carbons to form helium, and then helium nuclei collide. Hydrogens to form helium, and then helium nuclei colliding to form carbon. Every carbon atom in every living creature has been formed by such a wildly improbable collision. You can imagine how improbable life is now, because all carbon atoms have come from the stars, highly improbable, and we are recycling carbon. When we talk about sustainability, this is what we are talking about. We are recirculating all the elements that we are using up in other activities. But in biology itself, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. The famous statement made by Dostoevsky as early as 1973. This was when the first conflicts between the evolutionary doctrine and Christianity came into being. He says it is a blunder to mistake the Holy Scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. Only if symbols are construed to mean what they are not intended to mean, then there arise imaginary insoluble conflicts. This is something that needs to be understood. But what is chemistry? Chemistry has been best defined by Arthur Kornberg, biochemist who discovered DNA polymerase and fired the first shot of the biotechnology revolution. In an article when he was quite old, Kornberg wrote this. He called chemistry the lingua franca of the medical and biological sciences. If you're studying biology or chemistry, you must know biology or medicine, you must know chemistry. As the year 2000 approached, a little over 20 years ago, the journal Nature had an essay every week. And in this, scientists were asked to write on what they thought was the most important advance of the 20th century. One essay which I read has remained embedded in my mind, and that was entitled The Detonator of the Population Explosion. And this was by the Canadian Václav Smil. What he said was the world might be better off without Microsoft and CNN. And neither nuclear reactors nor space shuttles are critical to human well-being. But the world's population would not have grown from 1.6 billion to today's 6 billion. Today it is 7+ billion without the Haber-Bosch process. This is a remarkable statement. When we talk about the environment, we also have to worry about population explosion. What happens when you have population explosion is you need to grow more food. If you need to grow more food, you need an agricultural revolution. The first agricultural revolution of the 20th century was really triggered by the Haber-Bosch process, which is pictured on the slide. The conversion of gaseous nitrogen and gaseous hydrogen under high pressure temperature with an iron-based catalyst to ammonia. Because the ammonia then opened the route to urea, which is the first fertilizer used in agriculture. Now, it turns out the chemical fertilizers came into being with the use of urea. The Haber-Bosch process is taught in school. It's taught in undergraduate programs, even if you're not going to study chemistry as a profession. But the Haber-Bosch process is rarely recognized as a turning point in technology. Conversion of nitrogen to ammonia is a biologically important process, nitrogen fixation. That, of course, happens much more efficiently with an enzyme nitrogenase. That's done by bacteria. I'll show you another contribution of chemistry here and relate it to the environment. This is the discovery of DDT, complex name, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, simple symmetrical structure. Mueller got a Nobel Prize very shortly after he discovered DDT. Why was this? This was because DDT was immediately realized that it was an extraordinarily efficient poison against insects. It could kill, on the one hand, the Anopheles mosquito, which was responsible for malaria. On the other hand, it could kill the insects which preyed on crops. The result of this is you had one simple molecule, a product of synthetic chemistry, which now had immense application in both agriculture and medicine, and the Nobel Prize was given. DDT was widely used. And in the early 1960s, this book appeared, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carson was a nurse, and this is now widely recognized, you can see from the cover, as the classic that launched the environmental movement. And on World Environment Day, it is appropriate that we remember this book. What did Carson write here? She said, we are rightly appalled by the genetic effects of radiation. This is because in the late 1950s and in the early 1960s, the effects of the atomic bomb explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were still widely recognized. She then asks this very important question, how then can we be indifferent to the same effect in chemicals that we disseminate widely in our environment? Today, the environmental movement will argue about the use of pesticides in agriculture. You need pesticides if your agricultural yields are to improve. At the same time, pesticides can cause other kinds of damage. They can cause problems for the people who consume contaminated food. So biology and chemistry, nature and chemistry and biology are intimately connected. Sometimes this convergence of chemistry and biology can lead to new fields. Today, the field and one which I've been interested in after my retirement, chemical ecology. This has been described by one of its founders, Tom Eisner, as the product of a partnership between biologists and natural product chemists, united by a shared vision and empowered by complementary skills. I like this phrase, shared vision and empowered by complementary skills. We could solve so many problems if we had a shared vision and if we had complementary skills and we collaborated with one another. He goes on to say that the vision stems from the realization that all organisms emit chemical signals and that all in their respective ways respond to the chemical emissions of others. All of communication in biology, in nature, is by chemicals, whether it is microbes communicating with microbes, microbes communicating with plants, plants communicating with insects, insects communicating among themselves. This is all chemical communication. We are the only animals who communicate extensively by sound and by language and have developed these enormously complicated languages. To understand nature, you must understand the fundamental chemistry of biology. You need biochemistry. But many years ago, again at the turn of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st, Sidney Brenner, the famous molecular biologist, said this. He said, I once made the remark that two things disappeared in 1990. One was communism, the other was biochemistry, and that only one of these should be allowed to come back. Brenner obviously had not visited Kerala, and Brenner obviously did not understand that at least communism will stay alive in one form or the other, as it has in Russia and in China. Biochemistry, however, he went on to add, does not have to be resurrected because it provides the only basis for the causal understanding of biological mechanisms. We have to understand nature. We even have to understand it in order to protect it. We must understand how nature functions. Sometimes biochemistry is very important. Here's the 1945 Nobel Prize, once again for an agricultural advance in nutritional chemistry and agricultural chemistry. The Finnish scientist Arturi Virtanen got the prize for a method for preserving fodder through the long, cold Scandinavian winters. And what he did was he knew that this was a biological fermentation which spoiled the fodder. In order to stop this, you have to lower the pH. And he did this by adding sulfuric and hydrochloric acids. This was the elementary chemistry that was used. And this is what fetched him the Nobel Prize. Today, we know that we can conserve fodder in the form of silage and hay by many other ways. We can have biological control with lactic acid producing bacteria being introduced, which will keep the medium pH low. So understanding chemistry and biochemistry is useful, as in the case of ammonia, as in the case of DDT, or as in the case of the fodder preservation. Where do biology and chemistry meet? Biology deals with organisms and their behavior. That's nature. To understand biology, three pillars are needed: evolution, variation and selection, genetics, which is the transmission of hereditary characteristics from one generation to the other, and last of all, chemistry, because it's the chemistry of the DNA double helix which really tells us how genetics happens and also how genetics can be varied through random mutation and natural selection for phenotype. And therefore, chemistry is hugely important when we want to understand how information is transmitted from generation to generation through the nucleic acids. On World Environment Day, you might also ask another question. What are the important technologies which are transforming our lives over the last so many years? One is information technology, the other is biotechnology. And if you take these two dominant technologies of our times, they have their roots in fundamental science. They can be traced back to the work of two men. One is Claude Shannon, and the other is Oswald Avery, who established that DNA is the genetic material. Shannon is the man who wrote the first paper on information theory, and a very influential paper. Now, he also wrote a thesis for his PhD at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1940. And it's interesting that his title of his thesis was An Algebra for Theoretical Genetics. So today, if you look at information technology, one of its major applications is in understanding the vast amount of biological information that we are generating. This information is essential if one wants to understand the environment. Biochemistry is dominated by chemical complexity, and that's what a metabolic chart shows. But one should not be intimidated by the complexity, because people have now begun to try and understand what is the logic of biochemistry. How did biochemistry evolve in the first place? And that logic of biochemistry is better understood by looking at the interrelationships between the major cellular pathways of energy production. I want to digress for a moment, because when we talk about the environment, what we see in our environment are plants, vegetables, fruits, and so on. I show you the red pepper here. All of you are familiar with it. And the extremely spicy taste of red pepper is because of the molecule which I show you there, which is capsaicin. You might ask the question, why does the plant produce capsaicin and how does it do it? Now, it does produce capsaicin, but it is an enormously complicated biosynthetic pathway, which I've shown on the left. Each arrow is a chemical transformation, and that arrow has a biochemical catalyst, an enzyme, which now requires a gene in order for the enzyme to be synthesized. This would then mean that the organism, that is the plant, is now investing a huge amount of metabolic energy in actually producing capsaicin. Why does it produce capsaicin? It obviously produces capsaicin, which we call a secondary metabolite, for its own benefit. I want to show you this connection a little bit because sometimes this is not very clearly understood. The pandemic has taught us many things. One of the things that the pandemic taught me is to read more carefully. And early last year, I read this article in the New Yorker, which is called "Does Hurting Make Us Human?" A very, very interesting article about the lady who was pictured on the left. This lady felt no pain. So even after very painful surgery, she didn't even need a paracetamol. On the other hand, she also had no negative emotions at all. She had an infinite capacity to feel good, and she had what they call an expansive capacity for positive emotion. Because of her unusual emotional composition and her insensitivity to pain, she was investigated. And when she was investigated, there was a genetic defect which was discovered. And this genetic defect was in an enzyme, a very simple enzyme, fatty acid amide hydrolase. Simple name. All it does is it hydrolyzes fatty acids, fatty acid amides. Which fatty acid amide does it hydrolyze? It hydrolyzes this compound on the left, which is called anandamide. And I think when you hear the word anandamide, you can immediately see its Sanskrit origins. It comes from ananda, which means bliss. What does it hydrolyze it to? It hydrolyzes it to arachidonic acid and ethanolamine. Arachidonic acid is a constituent of membranes. Ethanolamine is not only a constituent of phospholipids, it is also a constituent of neurotransmitters. These are central molecules in our metabolism. They combine in the reverse direction to make anandamide. So it is really this inability to hydrolyze endogenous anandamide which led to this lady's wonderful capacity not to feel unhappy. Where does anandamide act? Anandamide acts on the cannabinoid receptor in the brain. And many, many years ago, in the early 1960s, the active constituent of marijuana, of hashish, of bhang, widely consumed in Uttar Pradesh, was identified as the molecule that I show you, trans-delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, in a 1964 paper. This was done by the Israeli scientist Raphael Meshulam. And Meshulam wondered, the plant is producing a molecule, and it has this wonderful effect on human brain. Is there a receptor for it? And if so, why is the receptor there? It must be there to recognize an endogenous molecule. So he went back and looked at pigs, and from pig brain, he isolated anandamide. The next slide summarizes this. This is a slide which is now a combination of chemistry and biology. On the right, I show you a mass spectrum that allows you to determine the structure of anandamide. On the left, I show you a radio-labeled displacement assay, which allows you to show the binding of anandamide to the rat brain membranes. He coined this name from Sanskrit. So when this work was done, and you can see it's taken 30 years to understand this facet of nature, he said, we looked for a Hebrew name, but as you may well be aware, Jews are not very happy. We have a lot of words for being down and so on, but not so many words for extreme joy. I was rather pleased when I read this because that means we Indians have many words for extreme joy. But in today's world, there seems to be little scope for extreme joy. But the moral of the story is this. For every molecule that you see in living systems, there must be a complex biosynthetic pathway, a chemical pathway, which converts substrates to products, assembly line production. And for every catalyst that you have, enzymes, you need a gene. So all of this must be encoded now into your genomes. The importance of proteins as enzymes was recognized very early by Francis Crick, as early as 1958. But he said something very interesting. He said, it is at first sight paradoxical that it is probably easier for an organism to produce a new protein than to produce a new small molecule. And this is true. It is easier to produce protein than it is to produce metabolites and secondary metabolites. Today, we know a huge amount about genes. Ever since the Human Genome Project was completed, and I made this slide some time ago, they were, at the time I made it, 789 eukaryotic genomes. And you can see, you can make a tree by comparing these genomes. And from this phylogenetic tree, you can show that human beings and chimpanzees are close to one another. Rats and mice are close to one another. And most interestingly, pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, and dogs are close to one another. And in fact, all of us are probably coming from one branch. This tells you what I call the unity of nature. When we fight about cattle and pigs and sheep and monkeys and human beings, we must realize that we're all part of nature. When we don't do this, it is immaterial to declare one day as World Environment Day and say that we are going to protect our environment. Biological information is exploding, so there is no excuse for not trying to understand it. And in real time today, you can see graphs like this on the internet. The genome size and protein coding genes come on real time. But I'm going to ask a question here, one which might resonate with Dr. Nautiyal. We can ask, how did the Earth itself, how did life evolve on Earth? The Earth itself was formed 567 million years. That's the date given on this slide. About, let's say, 5.5 billion years ago. For the first 1.5 billion years, very little happened. It was only much later, that was when chemistry happened. It was only much later that biology began to happen in the Archean period. Then you'll find suddenly an event marked GOE, that is the grand oxygenation event. When the Earth's atmosphere got oxygenated, photosynthetic bacteria appeared. Before that, you had only anaerobes. After that, you began to have aerobes. So it's microorganisms which came on the planet first. So when you're protecting the environment, are we protecting the microbes? We must ask. Animals, small animals came. Plants came fairly late. And then, of course, we came very much later, right towards the purple end of the slide. So you can see that we are very recent inhabitants of the Earth, rather arrogant inhabitants who now decide what is the environment that must be protected. Today, science has advanced so much that you can, in fact, do dating from organisms which are now found in various rock formations, sort of preserved there as fossils, a biological fossil record which can also yield a chemical fossil record at some point in time. People have worried about how chemicals could have evolved on Earth. This is the first and most famous experiment, the Origins of Life experiment done by Stanley Miller in Chicago in the early 1950s, where he filled a flask with ammonia, methane, hydrogen, and steam, all gaseous, and then passed a spark discharge and corrected the discharge and got the paper chromatogram that I show you on the top left. He found the amino acids. But you know, when you look at the same flask 50 years later, and in America they preserved the flasks, and you look at it with the new techniques of electrospray ionization mass spectrometry, you see many, many more compounds were found. So we now have an understanding of how chemistry might evolve. But we still don't have a very good understanding of how biology might evolve. Because long ago, Rudolf Virchow made a famous statement, translated says, all cells must come from cells. So then you can ask, when did the first cell come? which is what on this arrow here is marked as a root. So the tree of life that you see in a textbook, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, there's a root. What was the last universal common ancestor? This is how we understand our beginnings. Today, we fight a lot about who our ancestors were, but we really don't know who our real ancestors were. Chemistry has also shown you this prebiotic chemistry is being investigated. Paradoxically, hydrogen cyanide, an extremely toxic molecule with which Hitler killed millions of Jews. This molecule is the one which appears to be a precursor for the nucleic acid bases. This chemistry now is understood. Where can other chemicals come from? They can come from comets. And in early Earth, even much of the water came from comets. The oceans may have formed from comets. But there's formaldehyde and there's hydrogen cyanide. And once you have formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide, a little bit of copper, which is there in the earth, hydrogen sulfide, which is there in the earth's core, you can get this marvelous chemistry where you begin to see the appearance of biochemistry. This is a paper which appeared a few years ago in Nature Chemistry. So there's a lot going on here to understand these processes. But the fundamental question that we may ask is, why is life the way it is? Bacteria evolved into complex life just once in 4 billion years of life on Earth. All complex life shares many strange properties, from sex to aging and death. This question has been posed in this book by Nick Lane, and he calls it a vital question. Today, you might paraphrase this question is, why is our environment the way it is? You will not understand why our environment is the way it is unless you understand the history of human development. And the history of human development is very old. If I go back to 200,000 BC, and I've pulled this from YouTube on the internet, there are many places where these things are available. There were hardly any human beings here 200,000 years ago, which is a minuscule time scale when you think that the Earth is 5.5 billion years old. That little gray shade on the east of Africa is all that was there. By the time it is 32,000 BC, you can see gray shade has spread. The Americas is still virgin, but otherwise the gray shade has spread to most parts of the world. You can ask yourself the question, these were your ancestors. What were they doing? Were they still hunter-gatherers like animals? Or had they begun to form stationary societies? Because by 2,000 years ago, this is what the world looked like. The civilizations had come. Everybody had begun to fight with everybody else. Religions had evolved. We must remember that religions have evolved. Human beings came much earlier. There was no religion. And religions came only after societies. And the most important thing is to understand this. Because why did societies form? That was with the invention of agriculture. It was how to get food. Without fields, you need to protect them. If you need to protect a field, you need many people. Therefore, you need to form groups. And the evolution of societies then took place. Today, we might understand a great deal of this from today's biological technologies, the analysis of DNA. And Tony Joseph's, which is a popular book, The Early Indians, is something that people should read, especially in a condition like in which India finds itself today, where everybody is fighting with everyone else. We are not going to protect our environment by that. We are going to protect our environment only if we understand nature. If we're going to understand nature, we have to understand ourselves. Ancient DNA is very recent. When I retired in 2014, there were hardly any ancient DNA samples analyzed. Today, you can see there are over 7,000 when the slide was made, shown a few years ago. I draw your attention to this book, which is a brief history of humankind. You must understand your history if you're going to protect the environment. You can't protect the environment by saying that other people should not do something. What the Israeli historian Yuval Harari did is to ask this question. Why are human beings the way they are? And then he says a very interesting thing. He asks this question, when did history diverge from biology? In 32,000 years or 30,000 years ago, human behavior was dominated by biology, just like all animals. They hunted for food, they were hunter-gatherers. You can still find them in the Andaman Islands and elsewhere in the world. He says that once cultures appeared, they never ceased to change and develop, and these unstoppable alterations are what we call history. He goes on to add the cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology. And he says to understand the rise of Christianity or the French Revolution, it is not enough to comprehend the interaction of genes, hormones, and organisms. It is necessary to take into account the interaction of ideas, images, and fantasies as well. You might ask now, how did cultures evolve? Cultures evolved because of inventions and advances in science and technology, right from the beginning, from the invention of fire to everything else. Bronowski says this very well. He says it, among the multitude of animals which scamper, fly, burrow, and swim around us, man is the only one who is not locked into his environment. That word environment is important on World Environment Day. What is that environment? His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety, and his toughness make it possible for him not to accept the environment, but to change it. That's what we've done. That series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution. And he says, I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man. But the culture that he is referring to is not the culture that you and I know. The culture that he is referring to is the culture of invention. It's the culture of science. It's the culture of the new technologies. At every century, something's been invented and something's become better. Invention of the printing press, for example, allows us to do so many things. Today, we know every invention is needed. Otherwise, we cannot even have this lecture. We might ask one scientific question. What is culture and how does it evolve? It turns out that cultural transmission is more complex than genetic transmission, occurs on short time scales, even within a single generation. What politicians do is they try to ensure that cultural transmission happens very quickly. It happens on their time scales. Now, the question that you might then ask is, can cultural evolution, and I use the word culture in quotes, can it influence biological evolution? Here's an example. We all drink milk, but we were not born to drink milk. We were born to drink mother's milk, and after weaning, like all mammals, we would no longer drink milk. When did we start drinking milk? We started drinking milk only after the invention of dairy farming. But in order for us to digest the lactose in the milk, we need the enzyme lactase, which breaks it into glucose and galactose. Otherwise, we will have indigestion. We will have what is called lactose intolerance. And if you have very severe lactose intolerance, you will have uncontrollable diarrhea and you will eventually get dehydrated and die. This is what would have happened 30,000 years ago when you first started. Only those people, and this was natural selection at work, who did not die, who would have lived to reproduce, which means the problem of lactase persistence, that is, the lactase gene is now not shut off after baby develops, that the populations have been selected. Now, if you look across the world map, now you can analyze that almost everybody has lactase persistence. If you go to the heart of Africa, nobody can digest milk. They may do it now because they feel uncomfortable, they can still manage. We also know that diarrhea is self-limiting. We also know that you can get hydrated, so you can still manage. You can see that between south of India and the north of India, there are fairly significant differences between the Far East. So today, if one were doing policy in nutrition, you would not now try to address famine in South Africa by taking them dairy products from the richer countries of the Western Hemisphere. So science is important. But I'll really come to the conclusion of my presentation now by telling you that the first organisms to come on Earth were the microorganisms. So if you want to protect the Earth in all its pristine beauty, then you must get rid of human beings and only have microbes. That, of course, is unacceptable. But of course, we might still find microbes interesting, study them, and maybe use them. This slide was made as a tribute, really, to the man who gave us, Carl Wulff, who gave us the archaea, the third branch of the tree of life. Now, when he died, I found this tribute to him on the internet. Someone had put it up, and it had this wonderful picture of the tree of life. It had a tablet which said something attributed to Pliny the Elder, and whose bust. What it says here is nature is to be found in her entirety, nowhere more than in her smallest creatures. I'd like to paraphrase this to say it's not nature which is to be found in her entirety. It is chemistry and biology which are to be found in their entirety in microbiology, because you have the most fascinating chemistries, the most fascinating adaptations to extreme conditions which come. Lastly, look at the coronavirus. Is it part of your environment? Yes, it is. Should you protect it? Obviously not. But what is it? Does it belong to chemistry or does it belong to biology? You're a center now for biomedical research. By itself, the virus has no life. It's truly parasitic. It will multiply only after infection. All by itself, it is a collection of inanimate, highly ordered chemicals. I would practically say it is crystalline. It is cold, lifeless, and crystalline. Transforms into this extraordinarily prolific organism for reproduction once it has infected the right cell. How do we define this? Do we call it as part of chemistry or do we call it as biology? I'd like to suggest that viruses inhabit what I would call the shadowy no man's land between chemistry and biology. The line of actual control, which divides countries, also sometimes divides subjects. Occasionally, that line of actual control changes. Today, I think the line of actual control has actually been muddled between chemistry and biology, very much by the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. The virus itself was defined wonderfully by Peter Medawar. He called it a piece of bad news wrapped up in a protein. That's what it is. It is really chemistry. Lastly, you might ask, why do I draw your attention to such a disparate group of subjects? It is because of the environment, today's World Environment Day. You might ask, what is the environment? The environment is not only the plants that we protect once a year. It is the climatic, social, and political environments in which we live today. Some reflections on the role of chemistry and biology in shaping nature may allow us to introspect on the course of human history and attempt to understand why the world today is the way it is. Why do scientists celebrate World Environment Day? It is because science is a deeply humbling subject. And what I hope I've done in this presentation is that I hope I've conveyed to you how any attempt to understand even the smallest of nature's creations can be deeply humbling. Lastly, my acknowledgements. I have only two. They are the acknowledgements to the institutions which I have served, the Indian Institute of Science for much of my professional career, over 40 years, and the National Center for Biological Sciences on the bottom right, which is the institution which has provided me shelter in my retirement days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Wonderful talk, and I must say, the way you intertwined chemistry, biology, and even to an extent geology, I think it was absolutely amazing and wonderful. And I think we can only have a person of your stature to be able to carry this in the way you did, very lucidly and very simply. May I request Professor P.K. Seth to make the presidential remarks, sir?
Thank you very much, Alok. And friends, you will agree that it is the talk which you just heard from Professor Balram. He, in his own charismatic manner, how he viewed the nature through the chemistry and the biology. In his talk, he has brought up the evolution of the biology and how interdependent are there between the chemistry and the biology. I wish if this talk was a real one, not virtual, you would have enjoyed much more. Balram, when he speaks and when he gestures, it so communicates so well, and I'm missing that. I have heard his talk at several forums, and always he has been a great communicator. Some of the important points which have come up is about the understanding. And in very simple terms, if you look at the soil chemistry influence the coming up of the plants, or even the nature or the people who live on the certain type of the soils or the climate, their behavior, their actions are very much related. And that is the continued influence of the chemistry on the biology of the particular human beings. I was reminded of some of the experiments which were done much, much earlier, and that is the Michael Jouvet. Michael Jouvet, who had worked for sleep, and he was trying to find out what could be the possible chemical which is involved in the production of the sleep. He was experimenting with serotonin, and he published a paper where he raised the question mark, is there a metabolite, the aldehyde? And there again, the importance of the chemistry comes, whether this aldehyde is there, or there is some other metabolite of serotonin which is actually contributing to the sleep. And at that time, I was involved in some of those studies, and I tried to, while working at the Chicago Medical School, we did some experiments, totally basic chemistry experiments, trying to trap the aldehyde with the same carbazole, and then making this aldehyde biologically using the monoamine oxidase enzyme, and then finally testing it in the using the chicks and trying to show, yes, this aldehyde has a role in the sleep. So understanding the biology, I think we are very, very much dependent on the chemistry understanding, and through this chemistry knowledge, we can talk about and understand. Today with this coronavirus, I think lots and lot of studies, which is to understanding of the chemistry is involved, and that's on the basis of which the various type of the what the corona is doing to the human body will be possible to understand. I think Dr. Balram has, as usual, in a very convincing manner, he has explained, I think, and I'm sure everybody has enjoyed that how important role the chemistry and biology have to understand the nature. And nature itself is how much dependent on the chemistry. When the very first slide is showed that it is very difficult to leave the nature, and it's also very difficult to penetrate beyond the nature. I think that's where the role of the chemistry and biology is so important. I thank this opportunity to be there and participating and attending this lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Balram, and thank you, Alok, for giving me an opportunity.
Thank you so much, sir. And I see Professor Sandeep Verma also attending. He's the secretary of SERB. Dr. Sandeep, would like to make some remarks on this occasion?
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. Good afternoon, sir. How are you? So nice.
I should take this opportunity also to wish Dr. Kamboj, whom I saw.
Yes, I mean, my wishes to all seniors, all distinguished listeners. Sir, it was a very illuminating talk, as usual, very inspiring, and I'm so happy that I could join. And I wish Dr. Dhawan for this, for making this happen under the aegis of CBMR. Thank you, sir. I hope to see you sometime soon. Back to you, Dr. Alok.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
a lot.
Sandeep. Thank you. So I'll now request Professor Neeraj Sinha, the Dean of CBMR, to kindly propose a vote of thanks, please.
Thank you, sir. So it is my great pleasure to extend our vote of thanks on behalf of all the faculty of CBMR to Professor Balram for such a interesting and illuminating talk. And yes, we had a pleasure of interacting with him during his visit in 2009 to CBMR. And after such a long time, we could listen to him once again on this platform. And for this, I would first like to thank Professor P.K. Seth, Dr. Kamboj, and Dr. Nautiyal for arranging, for co-hosting this interesting talk. And I would also like to thank Dr. Sandeep Verma, Dr. Poonam Kakkad, and Professor Samit Sharma, and many scientists who could join today from CMAP and NBRI, and also from IITR. I could see some of the people from there. And last, I would like to thank all the faculty members of CBMR and Professor Alok Dhawan for hosting such an interesting and talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Neeraj. Thank you, Professor Balram, once again.
Thank you.
Bottom of my heart,
Thank you
for
very
accepting
much.
this invitation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Namaskar, Dr. Kamboj sir. डॉक्टर संदीप वर्मा जी आपका नाम ले रहे थे। डॉक्टर कंबोज, डॉक्टर संदीप वर्मा जी ने आपका नाम लिया, उन्होंने देख लिया था आपको स्क्रीन पे। जी
आवाज गायब है।
नहीं, आपकी आवाज आ रही है।
मेरी आ रही है?
हाँ जी, आ रही है।
हाँ, बोलिए, मैंने सुना नहीं था आपको।
अच्छा, मैं ही कह रहा था डॉक्टर संदीप वर्मा जी आपको याद कर रहे थे, आप फेस देखा आपका, उन्होंने तो आपका नाम
ओके, थैंक यू। ओके, थैंक यू वेरी मच।
थैंक्स सर।
थैंक यू।
नमस्कार।